The letter arrived on a Tuesday in the spring of 1882, folded twice inside a plain envelope that smelled faintly of lavender, and when Clara Whitmore pressed it between her fingers, she understood with absolute certainty that it represented the last door left open to her in the entire world. She was 22 years old, standing in the narrow hallway of her aunt's boarding house in Cincinnati, Ohio, wearing a dress that had been mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible beneath the patches. Her aunt, a hard-faced woman named Edith Blount, had given Clara until the end of the month to either pay her board or vacate the room she had occupied since both her parents died of typhoid fever the previous winter. Clara had no money. She had no prospects. She had applied for work at 3 different shops on 4th Street and been turned away at each one. The letter in her hand was an answer to an advertisement she had placed in the Cincinnati Enquirer 2 months prior, an advertisement she had written with shaking hands and a burning sense of humiliation, offering herself as a correspondent to any gentleman of decent character seeking a wife in the Western Territories. She had received 4 letters in response. 3 she had discarded immediately, as the men behind them seemed interested only in free labor or something far worse. The 4th letter was the one she now held, and she had read it so many times the paper was soft at the creases. It was from a man named James Calloway, of Harlan County, Colorado, who described himself as a cattle rancher of 30 years of age, a widower with a modest but honest operation, and a man who believed, in his own careful words, that a good life was built between 2 people who respected each other and worked together toward something worth having. He had not promised her love. He had not made grand declarations. He had simply said he needed a partner, and he hoped she might consider becoming one, and that he would pay her train fare and ensure she wanted for nothing in terms of shelter and provision. Clara read the letter a 5th time, then folded it carefully back along its original creases, tucked it into the pocket of her patched dress, and walked upstairs to pack everything she owned into a single carpet bag. Everything she owned fit with room to spare. She took the westbound train out of Cincinnati 3 days later, in the first week of May, when the air was still cool in the mornings but warm enough by afternoon that the prairie grasses she watched through the window seemed to breathe and shimmer like something alive. She had never been west of Indiana. She had never traveled alone. She sat very straight in her seat and watched the land open up around her with something caught between terror and wonder, and she thought about the man who had written her that careful, honest letter and tried to form a picture of him in her mind. She could not quite manage it. He was a shape without a face, a voice without a sound. But the letter was real and the train was moving, and there was nothing behind her worth going back to. So she kept her eyes on the horizon and let the miles accumulate. The town of Harlan Creek sat in a wide valley between 2 sets of foothills in the southwestern corner of Colorado Territory, and when Clara stepped off the train platform on a bright Saturday morning in mid-May of 1882, the first thing she noticed was the sky. It was enormous. It was a shade of blue she had no word for, deep and clear, and utterly without limit, and it made her feel very small in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. The second thing she noticed was that the platform was crowded and noisy, and that she did not know what James Calloway looked like and had no idea how to find him among the dozen or so men who lingered near the station. She stood holding her carpet bag with both hands and tried to look calm. A voice came from her left. "Miss Whitmore," she turned. The man standing 3 feet away from her was not what she had imagined. He was tall, considerably taller than she had expected, with broad shoulders and a lean frame that spoke of years of physical work rather than anything cultivated. He wore a plain canvas jacket over a blue cotton shirt, dark trousers tucked into worn but clean boots, and a hat that had seen better days but sat on his head with an easy authority. His face was angular and weathered in the way of men who spent most of their lives outdoors, brown from the sun and creased at the corners of the eyes with lines that suggested he squinted often against the light. His hair beneath the hat was dark and a little longer than fashionable, and his eyes were a gray-green that reminded her, unexpectedly, of the river back home on an overcast day. He was, she thought with some surprise, a genuinely handsome man. He was looking at her with a kind of careful attention, as though he was taking note of her the same way she was taking note of him, and when their eyes met he reached up and removed his hat, holding it in front of him with both hands. "I'm James Calloway," he said. "I'm glad you made it safely." His voice was low and even, with a slight roughness to it that she would later learn came from years of shouting across open land and into the wind. "Clara Whitmore," she said, and her own voice came out steadier than she had expected. "Thank you for meeting me." There was a brief pause in which they looked at each other and neither of them seemed entirely sure what came next, and then James Calloway nodded once, as though he had come to some internal decision, and said, "My wagon's just across the street. It's about an hour's ride out to the ranch if you're up for it after your journey." "I'm quite well," she said. "An hour is nothing." He almost smiled at that. Not quite, but almost. The corners of his eyes creased slightly, and something shifted in his expression that she filed away without quite naming. The wagon was a simple working flatbed with a bench seat at the front, hitched to two solid-looking bay horses. James helped her up onto the seat with a brief offered hand, took her carpet bag and stowed it in the bed of the wagon without comment on its lightness, and climbed up beside her. They rolled out of Harlan Creek and onto the road that wound south through the valley, and for the first several minutes neither of them spoke. Clara watched the land unfold around them. It was not pretty in the way she had thought the West would be, not dramatic mountains and rushing rivers, though she could see the mountains in the distance, blue and enormous on the horizon. The land here was more subtle than that. Rolling grassland, golden and green in the spring light, dotted with juniper and sage. The smell of it came to her on the breeze, and she had no name for it, but it went into her lungs and settled there like something she had been needing without knowing it. "It's bigger than I expected," she said eventually. James glanced sideways at her. "Most people say that. Either they love it or it makes them feel like they're drowning. Which did you feel when you first came here?" He considered the question with the same deliberate care she was already beginning to associate with him. "Both," he said. "At the same time, but the love won out." She thought about that. "How long have you been here?" 8 years. Came out from Missouri when I was 22. He paused. "Same age as you, I expect." "Yes," she said. "The same age." There was a comfortable silence after that which surprised her. She had expected the ride to be awkward and strained, two strangers calculating each other from behind polite facades. But the silence that settled between them as the wagon rolled through the spring valley was not uncomfortable. It was simply quiet, the way two people are quiet when they are paying attention to the same things. She would think about that later, that particular silence. She would think about it often. The Calloway Ranch sat on a slight rise above a creek that ran clear and quick through a stand of cottonwood trees, and when it came into view Clara's first feeling was one of profound relief, because it was real. She had spent the last several weeks worrying, in the small dark hours of the night, that the letter might have been a fabrication, that she might arrive in Colorado to find a derelict property or something worse. But what she saw was real and solid and plainly tended with care. A main house built of logs and river stone with a wide front porch, a good-sized barn painted red, 2 smaller outbuildings, and a set of corrals where she could see cattle moving slowly in the afternoon light. It was modest, but it was honest, exactly as he had described it. "It's not grand," James said, as though he could read her thoughts, and she heard the slight tension in his voice, a man bracing himself. "It's exactly what you said it would be," she replied, and meant it as a compliment, and from the way his shoulders eased slightly she understood he had taken it as one. He showed her inside. The main house had a front room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen separated by a short hallway, and 2 bedrooms at the back. One was clearly his, the door standing slightly open to reveal a spare but tidy room with a heavy quilt on the bed. The other was smaller, set up with obvious recent care, A new-looking quilt on the narrow bed, a small dresser with a mirror, a braided rug on the plank floor, and a jug of early wildflowers on the windowsill. Clara stood in the doorway of the small room and looked at the wildflowers for a long moment. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Flores put those there," James said from behind her, and she could hear him being careful not to take credit for a gesture he thought might seem presumptuous. "She wanted you to have a welcome." "Please tell her it worked," Clara said softly. She unpacked her carpet bag that evening, and the process took less than 10 minutes. She had 2 dresses besides the one she wore, a pair of good stockings, a small Bible her mother had given her, a photograph in a tin frame, her parents on their wedding day, a bar of soap wrapped in cloth, a comb, a small notebook, and a stub of pencil. That was everything. She arranged these few things on the dresser and the small shelf above the bed, and when she was done, she sat on the edge of the narrow mattress and looked at the room around her and took a long, slow breath. She had arrived with almost nothing, and yet the room around her was warm, and the flowers on the windowsill were yellow, and the smell of whatever Mrs. Flores had left simmering on the stove drifted down the hall and made her realize she was hungry in a way that felt almost hopeful. Mrs. Flores turned out to be a compact, bright-eyed woman of perhaps 50, with silver-streaked black hair, and a way of moving through the kitchen that suggested she had been the real authority in that house for some time. She was a widow herself, Clara would learn later, her husband having worked the Calloway ranch for 6 years before dying of a fever 3 winters ago. James had kept her on, paid her a fair wage, and she had elected to stay not just because she needed the income, but because, she told Clara frankly within 2 days of meeting her, she was fond of James Calloway in the way one is fond of a stubborn but good-hearted younger brother. "He works too hard and he doesn't talk enough," Mrs. Flores said, slapping bread dough onto the flour-dusted table with comfortable authority. "And he's been lonely since Maria died, though he would never say so. He doesn't say much about anything. You'll have to learn to read him." "Maria," Clara said carefully. "His wife. 3 years ago now, she died having their first child. The baby, too." Mrs. Flores's expression grew still for a moment. "It was a bad time. He nearly sold the ranch." "But he didn't." Clara absorbed this quietly. She had not known the details, only that he was a widower. She thought about the careful, measured letter he had written and understood it differently now, understood the restraint in it not as coldness, but as the language of a man who had learned that grief and hope cannot both be spoken at full volume. She was careful with him after that. Not pitying, she did not think he would tolerate pity, but careful in the way she chose her words, the way she gave him space in the mornings before he had spoken much, the way she did not press him to talk when he came in from the field silent and tired. In return, he was careful with her in ways she was slow to recognize because no one had ever been careful with her before. He noticed on the 3rd day that her boots were worn through at the sole of the right foot and said nothing about it, but came in the following evening with a pair of good work boots in what appeared to be her size. He had asked Mrs. Flores, she discovered later, who had thought to measure Clara's foot that morning on the pretext of fitting her for a borrowed apron. "You'll need proper boots for the land out here," he said, setting them on the table. "The ground's rough. It'll cut right through those." She picked one up and turned it in her hands. The leather was good and new, and the stitching was careful. "How much do I owe you?" she asked, because she had a strong aversion to charity, having lived on other people's tolerance for the past 6 months. He shook his head. "You don't," he said simply. "You're here to work alongside me and you need proper gear. It's the same as supplying a ranch hand." She thought she ought to argue. But the boots were sitting in her hands and her right foot was sore from the broken sole, so she said, "Thank you, James," and put them on. And when they fit nearly perfectly, she looked up and found him watching her with that almost smile again. The days that followed had a rhythm she found herself settling into with a naturalness that surprised her. She rose early, helped Mrs. Flores with breakfast, and then spent the mornings learning the workings of the ranch from whoever would teach her. James was patient but busy, and he often handed her off to his 2 ranch hands, a weathered older man named Pete Dunmore who had been working cattle since before the war, and a younger fellow named Hector Reyes, who was 19 and cheerful, and seemed to find Clara's determination to learn everything immediately both admirable and entertaining. "You're going to try to get on a horse today, aren't you?" Hector said one morning, leaning on the corral fence with his arms crossed and a look of resigned amusement on his face. "I'd like to learn," Clara said firmly. "You ever been on a horse in your life?" "Not yet." He laughed, a genuine delighted sound, and went to saddle the most good-natured mare in the string. She was not a natural horsewoman. The mare, whose name was Biscuit for reasons that were unclear to everyone on the ranch, including apparently the horse, was patient and slow, and Clara still managed to list alarmingly to the left for the better part of an hour before she found something approximating balance. Hector walked beside her with the calm manner of a man who had taught children to ride, and considered this roughly comparable. Pete watched from the fence, occasionally offering laconic commentary that might have been encouragement or might have been criticism. It was genuinely impossible to tell. James came back from the south pasture at midday to find Clara walking Biscuit in slow circles around the corral, her face set with concentration and her back painfully straight, and he stopped at the fence and watched her for a long moment. "She asked to learn," Hector said, coming to stand beside him. "I can see that," James said. He watched Clara make another careful circle. "She's staying on." "Mostly," Hector said. "She's got good instincts for keeping her balance. She's just not listening to her body yet." James nodded slowly. Clara completed another circle and spotted him at the fence and lifted her chin slightly in acknowledgement, refusing to look anything other than composed even though he could see the white-knuckled grip on the reins from where he stood. He almost laughed. He covered it by pushing off the fence and heading toward the barn. But the almost laugh stayed in his chest the rest of the afternoon like something warming. The formal arrangement between them was, at that point, exactly that. Formal. They were not married yet. The original plan, as described in his letter and her acceptance of it, was that she would come for a period of a month or two so they could determine whether they were suited to each other before proceeding to a proper marriage. James had been careful about this, careful to give her an exit if she needed one, and Clara had been grateful for it even as she had privately suspected she would not take it. She had nowhere else to go, which was a practical reality, but more than that she had found within the first several days that the man himself was considerably more than his cautious letter had suggested. He was not demonstrative. He did not pay compliments easily or speak warmly in the way of practiced charming men, but he was present in a way that mattered. He fixed the latch on her bedroom window because the draft bothered her, without being asked, simply noticing the way she pulled her shawl tighter whenever she passed that wall. He left the lamp burning in the front room on evenings when he knew she was reading, so she would not have to rise and light it herself when the light faded. He asked Mrs. Flores, who had taken it upon herself to begin teaching Clara to cook on a wood stove, what Clara's favorite foods had turned out to be, and the following week there was coffee cake on Sunday morning, which Clara had mentioned in passing, was the thing she remembered most fondly from her mother's kitchen. He gave without flagging it. He gave the way people give when generosity is simply a habit rather than a performance, and Clara, who had been on the receiving end of other people's pointed charity for the past 6 months, understood the difference immediately and felt it in a way that went well below the surface. She began to look for him at meals. She began to notice the sound of his boots on the porch in the evenings. She began, without quite meaning to find reasons to be in whatever room he happened to be in. She was not sure what to call this. She told herself it was gratitude. She told herself it was loneliness seeking out its nearest available cure. But she was an honest person by nature, and so eventually she stopped telling herself comfortable untruths and simply admitted, quietly and privately, and without quite knowing what to do about it, that she was falling in love with James Calloway. 3 weeks after her arrival, the nearest town of Harlan Creek hosted a Saturday market in the main square, and James drove her in on the wagon and let her walk through the stalls while he collected supplies from the hardware merchant. She bought, with the small amount of pocket money he had insisted she take that morning over her protests, a small paper of pins and a length of blue ribbon that was on offer, and she spent the rest of the time looking at everything with the wide, absorbing attention of someone storing up a new world. She met the Harlan Creek postmistress, a formidable woman named Agnes Hartwell, who had apparently been aware of Clara's arrival for some time, and subjected her to a frank and not unkind assessment that felt only slightly less thorough than a customs inspection. She met the family of one of James's neighboring ranchers, the Brennan family, who were warm and cheerful, and invited her to Sunday dinner the following week with the easy hospitality of people who considered company a simple good. She met the local pastor, Reverend Marsh, who shook her hand and told her that Harlan Creek was a good place to put down roots, and she noticed he said it with particular emphasis, as though he had opinions about what roots she might specifically be putting down. On the drive back, with the wagon loaded and the afternoon light going golden across the valley, James said, "People liked you." She looked at him sideways. "Did they?" "Agnes Hartwell doesn't shake hands with people she doesn't respect," he said. "She did with you," Clara thought about this, "and the Brennans. They invited you to Sunday dinner. They only do that with people they mean to keep." She looked at the road ahead of them, at the mountains going purple in the distance. "Do you want me to keep?" she asked, and then felt the question land in the space between them with more weight than she had intended. He was quiet for a moment. The horses moved at their steady walk. The wagon creaked. "Yes," he said, just that one word. But the way he said it was not casual and not careful. It was simply direct, in the way of a man who had thought about something for long enough that he was no longer uncertain about it. Clara looked at the mountains and pressed her lips together and said nothing for a moment because she was afraid her voice would betray too much. Then she said, "Good. Because I'd like to stay." Another silence, but a different kind than the ones before, a warmer kind. "Then let's talk about making it official," James said. "Whenever you're ready, no rush." She was ready faster than she had expected. The wedding took place on a Saturday in early June in the yard of the ranch house because the weather was perfect and because Clara had said, when asked, that she would rather be married outdoors under that enormous sky than in any building she had yet seen in Colorado. Reverend Marsh came out from town and Mrs. Flores made an elaborate cake that used eggs they had been saving for a week, and the Brennan family came, and Pete and Hector scrubbed up remarkably well and stood at the back looking vaguely moved by the proceedings. Clara wore the better of her two dresses, which was still plain and several seasons behind fashion, and had put the blue ribbon from the market in her hair. She had no veil, no flowers beyond the wild ones Mrs. Flores had cut that morning from along the creek bank, no jewelry except a small locket she wore around her neck that contained a miniature portrait of her mother. James wore his best coat and a clean shirt, and had polished his boots to a shine that Pete Dunmore later said he had never seen in 8 years of knowing the man. He stood at the front of the assembled group beneath the big cottonwood at the edge of the yard, and when Clara came around the corner of the house on the arm of Reverend Marsh's wife, who had volunteered to give her something resembling a proper walk up the aisle, James looked at her with an expression that was entirely unguarded in a way she had not yet seen from him, and what was in his face was not polite appreciation or careful regard. It was something much less defended than that. She felt it like sunlight landing squarely on her face. The ceremony was brief and honest, and Reverend Marsh, to his credit, kept the words simple and real. When James put the plain gold band on her finger, his hands were steady but warm, and he held her hand for a moment longer than the ceremony required, and she felt his thumb move once across her knuckle, a small gesture that was not quite an accident. At the celebration afterward, which involved Mrs. Flores's cake and a fiddle player from town and the Brennan children running in circles through the yard until they fell down from exhaustion, Clara stood at the edge of the porch and watched the evening come in over the valley and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not relief, though relief was there. Not gratitude, though that was there too. Something larger. Something that had to do with the word home, which she had not had a place to attach to for over a year. James came and stood beside her with 2 cups of the lemonade Mrs. Flores had made and handed her one. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. They stood together watching the fiddle player and the lanterns going up in the cottonwoods and the last pink of the sunset above the mountains, and neither of them needed to say anything more than that. That night, after the guests had gone and Mrs. Flores had returned to her own small cabin at the edge of the property, and the ranch was quiet except for the creek and the night sounds of the cattle, they sat together on the front porch in the wooden chairs that faced the valley. The stars over Colorado were different from any stars Clara had seen before, more numerous, closer, spread across the sky in a density that made her feel she was looking through a window into something vast and permanent. James told her about the ranch that night, really told her, not the careful factual account of his letter but the actual story of it. How he had come out from Missouri with $60 and a borrowed horse, and a certainty that he needed to be somewhere that felt unfinished, somewhere he could build toward something. How the first winter had nearly killed him, not dramatically but quietly, through cold and loneliness, and the specific despair of a man who is not sure he has made a wise choice. How he had kept on anyway. How he had met Maria at a dance in Harlan Creek in the summer of his 3rd year here, a Mexican-American woman from a ranching family in the southern part of the territory, and how she had been the one to make the place feel possible. How losing her had made it feel like a punishment he did not entirely understand. He said all of this in his low, even voice, looking out at the valley rather than at Clara, and she listened without interrupting because she understood instinctively that he was not telling her this as performance but as a kind of offering, giving her the whole map of himself so she could navigate it. When he was quiet, she told him her own story. Her parents, the boarding house, the letter. The way poverty had felt less like a condition and more like a slow erasure, the gradual disappearance of options until she had found herself writing an advertisement for herself in a newspaper like a piece of furniture offered for sale. "I'm glad you wrote it," he said quietly. "So am I," she said. Now, only now, a slight lift of something in his voice, she considered. "I was glad on the train, I was glad when I saw the sky." He was quiet for a moment. "What changed your mind before you got here, I mean?" "Your letter," she said simply. "You wrote like someone who was telling the truth. I've been lied to enough times that I've become something of an expert in the distinction." He turned to look at her then, directly in the starlight. "I won't lie to you," he said. "I'm not always easy. I work too much and I go quiet when things are difficult, and I'm better with cattle than with people, generally. But I won't lie to you." "I know," she said, and she did know, with a certainty that had been building for 3 weeks and was now settled firmly in her like a fence post sunk in good solid ground. He reached over in the darkness and took her hand, and they sat like that for a long time, watching the stars above the Colorado Valley, and Clara Whitmore, who was now Clara Calloway, thought that whatever the word home meant, it was assembled of moments exactly like this one. The summer came on fast and hot and full of work. Clara had not been raised to ranch life, but she threw herself at the learning of it with a thoroughness that impressed even Pete Dunmore, who was not easily impressed by anyone. She learned to ride Biscuit properly, with a secure and easy seat that Hector said was better than some people he'd known who'd been doing it for years. She learned to read the weather in the way experienced ranchers do, from the smell of the wind and the color of the evening sky and the behavior of the horses before a storm. She learned to string fence wire with bruised hands and learned not to mind the bruising. She helped Mrs. Flores with the kitchen garden, expanding it considerably with seeds she ordered through the Harlan Creek General Store, and by August there were tomatoes and squash and beans in abundance, enough to put up for the winter. She kept accounts. This turned out to be the skill that surprised James most. She had always been good with numbers, it being one of the areas where her intermittent schooling had taken firm hold. And when she asked to look at the ranch's accounts one evening and then quietly pointed out 3 places where money was being lost through inefficiency rather than misfortune, James sat back in his chair and looked at her with an expression that was genuinely startled. "How did you see that?" he asked. "I added the columns differently," she said. "You're looking at it from the spending side. If you look at it from the income side first, the gaps show up." He stared at the ledger for a moment. "You're right. I usually am with numbers," she said, not boasting, just stating a fact, and then met his eyes and found him grinning, actually grinning. A full, unguarded grin that rearranged his whole face into something younger and warmer. She stared at him. In 2 months she had seen the almost smile a dozen times, and she had thought that was the extent of it, and now this. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said, looking back at the ledger, because if she kept looking at him while he looked like that she was going to say something she was not sure they were ready for yet. The grin did not leave his face for another hour. The summer also brought difficulties that were not internal to the ranch. The drought that had been affecting the southern portion of the territory crept northward through July, and by August the creek was running lower than James had seen it in 8 years, and the grass in the south pasture was sparse and dry. 2 of his neighbors were talking about selling part of their herds. A man from a land company out of Denver had come through Harlan Creek twice, offering what sounded like good prices for cattle and land, but which Pete Dunmore said, with characteristic directness, smelled rotten. "He's buying low," Pete said one evening on the porch, rolling a cigarette with practiced fingers. "He'll wait until ranchers are desperate enough that low is all they can get. It's how these companies work." James said nothing, but Clara saw the set of his jaw. "How much reserve do we have?" she asked James later when it was just the 2 of them at the kitchen table. "Enough for another 6 months," he said. "Maybe 8 if we sell 20 head before the price drops further." "Then we sell 20 head now," she said, "before the price drops further, and we use part of it to dig the well deeper because the creek level isn't coming back up this year." He looked at her across the table. "Where do you want to dig?" "I want to look at the map again. I've been watching where the cattails come back after a dry stretch. There's ground water deeper than the creek. You can see it in the plant distribution." He got the map. They sat at the kitchen table until nearly midnight, with the lamp burning low and the coyotes calling in the hills outside, working through the problem in the careful, practical way of 2 people who have both decided that the ranch is worth fighting for. And somewhere in the middle of calculating water tables and cattle prices, with Clara's finger tracing lines on a creased survey map and James leaning close beside her to see, their heads nearly touching in the lamplight, she became aware that he was no longer looking at the map. She turned her head and found his face very close and his gray-green eyes very direct. "Clara," he said. She did not say anything because her heart had made an abrupt and inconvenient decision to be very loud, and she was not sure she had enough breath left over for words. "I know we started this as a practical arrangement," he said, "and I know you came here because you needed somewhere to go. I don't want to make it complicated." "It's already complicated," she said quietly. Something shifted in his expression. "Is it?" "Very," she said. He reached up and very slowly, with the deliberateness of a man who does nothing carelessly, tucked a strand of hair back from her face. It was the smallest possible gesture, and it undid her completely. "Good," he said, just the way he had said it on the wagon the evening of the market. Just that one word. But the way he said it was a whole sentence. She kissed him. She had not planned to be the one who moved first, but there it was, and it was exactly as right as everything else about him had turned out to be, warm and careful, and with a depth behind it that she felt all the way to her heels. When they broke apart, he was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, open and unhurried and entirely certain. "I should have said it already," he said. "I'm saying it now. I love you, Clara." She felt those words settle into her the way the smell of that land had settled into her lungs on the very first day, as though they were something she had been needing without knowing it. "I love you too," she said. I've been trying not to for about 6 weeks because I was afraid it was too fast. 6 weeks, he said, and the ghost of a smile was back but warmer now. I was afraid of it by the end of the first week. James Calloway, she said, you might have mentioned it. I'm mentioning it now, he said, and kissed her again, and this time neither of them pulled back for quite a while. The well they dug in September, following Clara's reading of the land, came in at a good depth with clean water, and it was the talk of the neighboring ranches for a month, because most of them were still running low. 2 of the neighboring ranchers came to see it and took away notes on the technique. One of them, a red-faced Irishman named Brendan Cole who ran 300 head on the land to the north, looked at Clara with undisguised admiration and said to James, "Your wife worked that out." "She did," James said, and there was something in his voice that Clara had come to recognize as pride, a particular warmth that he aimed at her when he thought she wasn't looking. She was always looking. The drought broke in October with 3 days of hard rain that turned the creek back to its summer level and washed the hillsides clean, and the territory went into the fall in better shape than most had feared. James sold his 20 head at a fair price in September, and the land company man came through one more time, and James met him on the porch and told him, with perfect courtesy and absolute finality, that the Calloway ranch was not for sale at any price, and the man went away and did not come back. Fall in the Colorado Valley was a different world from summer. The aspens in the hills went gold, and then orange, and then a fierce burning red, and the mornings came in with a cold that had teeth in it, and the sky went a deeper, more saturated blue than even the spring had offered. Clara fell in love with the fall the way she had fallen in love with the land itself, gradually and then all at once, and she rode out with James on clear October mornings when they could, up into the foothills where the aspens shook their gold leaves down around them like something from a story, and they talked or they didn't talk, and both were equally good. She learned things about him in those morning rides that she could not have learned otherwise. That he read more than anyone expected, that the small shelf of books in the front room was added to every time he went to town, and he had opinions about what he read that were considered and interesting. That he had wanted to be a school teacher when he was 12 years old, before the family farm failed and the practical imperatives of survival had rerouted him. That he was funny in a dry, almost invisible way that required attention to catch, and was therefore infinitely more satisfying when you did. He learned things about her too, that she could do mathematics in her head faster than most men could do it on paper. That she missed the sound of rain on a city roof, the particular percussion of water on slate and cobblestone. That she had a strong, stubborn streak that went bone deep, and that she had learned to disguise it under a surface of reasonable calm, but that it was always there underneath. That she was braver than she knew, and that what she had done, packing a single carpet bag and getting on a train to an unknown man in an unknown territory, was not an act of desperation but an act of extraordinary courage, and she had never considered it in those terms before he said it to her. "I was desperate," she pointed out. "Desperate people don't always choose bravery," he said. "You did." She thought about that for a long time afterward. November arrived, and with it the first real snow of the season, 4 inches overnight that transformed the valley into something silent and white and startling. Clara stood on the porch in the early morning watching it, and James came out behind her with a cup of coffee and put it in her hands without a word and stood beside her watching the snow. "I've never seen snow on mountains before," she said. "No. Cincinnati snow is gray by the time it's interesting. The buildings and the smoke." She looked at the far peaks, white against blue. "This is something else." "It gets harder than this," he said. "February can be brutal." "I'm not worried," she said. "No. I have good boots," she said, and looked up at him, and his face broke into the full grin again, the one that rearranged everything, and she laughed, which was a sound she had not made nearly enough before coming here and which she now made freely and often, because it turned out that James Calloway, despite all his quiet, had a very reliable talent for provoking it. He kissed her on the snow-cold porch with the coffee going cold in her hands, and the mountains standing enormous and white in the distance, and she thought, as she had thought before and would think many times again, that she had not known a life could turn around so completely, so quickly, so genuinely well. Mrs. Flores, who had watched all of this unfold with the satisfaction of someone who had been hoping for exactly this outcome, announced in November that her niece in Santa Fe was having a difficult pregnancy and needed her, and that she would be going south for some months but would return in the spring. "Can you manage without me?" she asked Clara with the specific directness of a woman who already knew the answer. "We'll manage," Clara said. "I know you will," Mrs. Flores said, and squeezed her hand with something that was more than practical, and set off on the southbound stage. Managing turned out to involve Clara becoming a better cook than she had expected to be. James, it turned out, was not without skills in the kitchen himself, a fact he had concealed with some care, possibly because he had been the primary ranch cook for the months between Maria's death and Mrs. Flores's hiring, and did not want to revisit that period in any dimension. Between the two of them, they kept the household running through November and into December with only moderate disaster, the most significant of which involved a pie that Clara was certain she had followed correctly but which came out of the oven with the structural integrity of something that had never been properly introduced to heat. James ate a full slice without comment. "James," she said. "It's good," he said. "It is absolutely not good," she said. "The filling is good," he said, with the careful honesty she had come to rely on. She threw a dish towel at him and he caught it, still eating the pie, and that was the evening she laughed so hard she had to sit down on the kitchen floor, and he sat down beside her on the floor, and they ate the rest of the failed pie, sitting on the kitchen boards with their backs against the cabinet, and the wood stove popping and the snow coming down outside the window. She could not remember a time in her life when she had been so simply happy. Christmas came to the valley with another heavy snowfall, and a warmth inside that had nothing to do with the wood stove. James had sent away for a gift in October, anticipating that the road to town might be impassable in December, and on Christmas morning there was a parcel on the kitchen table wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Inside was a copy of a book Clara had mentioned once, very briefly, as a book she had borrowed from a neighbor as a girl and always wanted to own herself. She could not imagine how he had remembered something mentioned so casually so many months ago. "James," she said, holding the book. "Merry Christmas," he said. She looked up at him, and whatever showed in her face made him look quietly, deeply pleased in the way he always looked when he had done something right for her, and she went to him and put her arms around him and held on. "You give me too much," she said into his shoulder. "I give you what you need," he said, his arms coming around her. "There's a difference. Most people can't tell the difference. I can," he said, "because I pay attention to you." She lifted her head and looked at him. "You pay attention to everything. To you especially," he said. They spent Christmas with the Brennan family in town, a large and cheerful affair with too much food and too many children and a fiddle player who was significantly worse than the one at the wedding but made up for it in enthusiasm. On the ride home, with the stars enormous above the snow-covered valley, Clara had her head on James's shoulder and the blanket around them both, and she told him, quietly and carefully, that she thought she might be expecting a child. He was very still for a moment. The horses walked on through the snow. She felt the breath he took. She knew about Maria. She knew what those words cost him to hear, what fear came with them. "Clara," he said. "I know," she said softly. "I know what you're thinking." "I'll take care of you," he said. "Whatever happens, I'll be right beside you." "I know that too," she said. He put his arm around her and she felt the tightness in it, the held-in fear that was also a held-in joy, and she pressed close to him and they rode home in the starlight without speaking again, but it was the most full silence she had ever known. The winter was long but not as brutal as he had warned her it might be. February brought 2 weeks of bitter cold that kept them mostly inside, and they spent those evenings by the fire with books and conversation and card games that James won with a suspicious consistency. until Clara figured out that Pete Dunmore had taught him to count cards and confronted him about it with the kind of indignation that mostly concealed how impressed she was. He taught her to count cards too. It became one of their private small traditions, the way couples accumulate shared languages over time, a private look when they were in company that meant you did not shuffle properly again, or I see what you're doing. March came slowly, the snow retreating up the hillsides and the creek running high with snowmelt, and the first tentative green appearing in the lowest pastures. Mrs. Flores returned from Santa Fe with her niece's new baby's description, and a package of seeds for the kitchen garden, and an expression of sharp satisfaction when she looked at Clara and James together, and confirmed what she had hoped when she left. "Good," she said simply, same word James used for everything that mattered. Clara thought it must be a ranching country word, an economy of language applied to the most important things. Spring was also when the difficulty with the Dawes family began. The Dawes family ran a sizable operation to the east. 3 brothers who had been in the valley longer than anyone else and who had managed, over the years, to edge several smaller ranchers off their land through a combination of disputed water rights, fenced-off access roads, and the specific kind of legal pressure that costs more to fight than the land is worth. They had made no move against the Calloway ranch in the previous year, but in April, with the valley greening up again, the eldest Dawes brother, a man named Rupert who was 60 and broad, and had the manner of a man who had never been told no by anyone who could make it stick, rode up to the Calloway ranch on a Wednesday morning and offered to buy the eastern 200 acres at a price that was 30% below what the land was worth. James said no, politely, and with the same finality he had used with the Denver Land Company man. Rupert Dawes looked at him for a long moment, then looked at Clara, who was standing on the porch, then looked back at James. "Think it over," he said, and rode away. "That's not the end of it," James told Clara that evening. "No," she agreed. "It isn't. The next thing was the fence. Someone cut a section of the Calloway fence along the eastern boundary in the first week of May, letting 20 head of Dawes cattle onto Calloway land. When James went to repair the fence and move the cattle back, a Dawes hand met him at the line and said the cattle had simply wandered through a section of fence that had been poorly maintained to begin with. James had maintained that fence 3 months ago. He kept his temper with admirable control and said so clearly, and returned home with the fence repaired and his jaw set. "He's provoking you," Clara said. "He wants you angry enough to do something he can use against you. I know that. Then don't be angry." "I'm not angry," he said through a visible effort of will. "I'm deeply annoyed." "That's better," she said. "Being deeply annoyed is legal." He almost laughed despite himself. "What do you think he wants, really?" "The water," she said. "The eastern 200 acres includes the upper tributary. If he owns it, he controls the flow to his north pasture." She had been looking at the survey maps again. "So this is about water. Almost everything out here is about water," she said. "You know that." He did know it. He thought for a moment. "There's a water rights filing I never completed," he said slowly. "I started it 3 years ago and then Maria died and I never went back to it." Clara looked at him steadily. "Then we need to go to the land office in Denver and complete it. Denver is 3 days by stage." "I know." He looked at her, at the roundness that was now visible beneath her dress, the child that would come in midsummer. "Clara, I'm fine," she said firmly. "The doctor in Harlan Creek says I'm healthy, and the confinement is 4 months away. A 6-day round trip to Denver is perfectly manageable." "I won't take any chances with you," he said, and the way he said it was not cautious or careful. It was fierce in the specific way of a man who had lost someone before and had reorganized his entire interior life around not losing again. She went to him and took his face in her hands. "James, I am strong and I am well and our child is well, and we are going to Denver to file the water rights, and then we are coming back and Rupert Dawes is going to have absolutely nothing to say about our land. Do you understand me?" He looked at her for a long moment with those gray-green eyes. Then he said, "I understand you. Good. They went to Denver. The city was a revelation to both of them in different ways. Clara, who had grown up in Cincinnati and thought she understood cities, found Denver's particular brand of frontier ambition startling and exciting. James, who had not been to a city larger than Pueblo in 8 years, moved through it with the slightly careful attention of a man who is very aware of how much he does not know about a given environment. The land office was a bureaucratic maze that took most of 2 days to navigate, partly because the original filing was misfiled under the wrong county record, and partly because the clerk responsible for water rights was a meticulous man who asked 17 questions for every form. Clara, who had the patience for this kind of thing and the arithmetic to back it up, handled the bulk of the process while James sat beside her and provided the required signatures and tried not to look like he found the whole enterprise mildly infuriating. By the afternoon of the second day, the water rights filing was complete and certified, and they had a document with the territorial seal on it that established the Calloway water rights to the upper tributary with a priority date that predated any Dawes claim by 4 years. James held the document and looked at it for a long moment in the afternoon light coming through the land office window. "You're remarkable," he said. "I just read the forms," she said. "You're remarkable," he said again, and folded the document carefully and put it in his breast pocket and took her arm to walk her out into the Denver afternoon. They had one evening in Denver before the stage back, and James spent it taking her to dinner at the best restaurant the city had to offer, which was a considerable step up from the Harlan Creek Saloon's limited menu, and which Clara dressed for in the better of her 2 dresses that were both, by now, showing their age in ways that she was not going to think about this evening. James thought about it, apparently, because over the soup course he pushed a small parcel across the table to her, flat and soft, wrapped in paper from a Denver dress shop. "James Calloway, what is this?" she said. "A dress," he said with the directness of a man who was not going to be elaborate about it. "You've worn the same 2 since you arrived. You need more than 2 dresses. I should have done it sooner." She opened the parcel. The dress inside was a deep blue wool with cream trim at the collar and cuffs, simple and well-made and beautiful, and she touched it with the specific careful reverence of someone who had not owned something this fine in a very long time. "James," she said, and her voice had gone soft in a way she could not prevent. "Don't argue with me about it," he said, but kindly. "I'm not arguing," she said. She stopped. "No one has ever taken care of me like this before you." He was quiet for a moment. "Then it was overdue," he said simply. She wore the dress the next morning on the stage back to Harlan Creek, and when they arrived home and walked up onto the porch of the ranch house in the late afternoon light, she felt so wholly different from the woman who had stepped off the train platform with a worn carpet bag 14 months earlier that she had to take a moment and simply stand still and acknowledge the distance she had traveled, not in miles but in the deeper sense, the sense that had to do with belonging and being known. Rupert Dawes came around in June to make another offer, and James met him on the porch with the certified water rights document in his hand and the quiet, unshakable manner of a man holding a winning hand and in no particular hurry to put it down. The conversation lasted approximately 8 minutes. When Dawes rode away, he looked smaller somehow, though his physical dimensions had not changed, and he did not come back. Pete Dunmore, watching from the barn door, spat on the ground in a gesture of eloquent satisfaction. "Well," he said. "Well," James agreed. Midsummer arrived with a heat that turned the valley golden and dry again, though nothing like the previous year's drought, and with it the approach of the birth, which Dr. Hartman from Harlan Creek had scheduled his presence around. Clara was healthy and strong throughout, which Dr. Hartman said was partly luck, and partly the fact that she was not a woman who could be persuaded by circumstances to rest when she considered herself capable of working, a trait he mentioned with professional exasperation, and she acknowledged with zero contrition. James was, in the final weeks, somewhere between stoic and terrified. And the way these two things coexisted in him was visible to Clara with the clarity of someone who had spent the better part of a year learning to read him. He did not say he was frightened. He simply began checking the lamp oil supply every evening and ensuring there was always extra water heated on the stove and asking Dr. Hartman questions with such thoroughness that the doctor at one point said, "Mr. Calloway, I have delivered 46 children in this territory without losing a mother. Your wife is strong and well-positioned. Try to sleep." "He's worried because of Maria," Clara told Dr. Hartman quietly when James had gone out to the barn on some pretext. "I know," the doctor said, his voice gentling. "He's right to tell himself this will be different because every birth is different. I'll be here." The baby came on a hot July morning in 1883, after a labor that Dr. Hartman described as straightforward and Clara described as somewhat more eventful than that. And when it was over, and the baby's voice announced itself to the valley with no apparent intention of being ignored, Clara lay back against the pillows and listened to James in the doorway saying something to Dr. Hartman in a voice that was not quite steady. And then the doctor said, "A healthy boy, James. Your wife is perfectly well." And the particular quality of the silence that followed that sentence was something Clara would never be able to describe adequately, though she would try, many times, to the boy himself when he was old enough to ask. James came in and she put their son in his arms and watched his face go through something that was entirely private and entirely transforming. He sat on the edge of the bed with the baby held as carefully as something irreplaceable, which he was, and looked at his son for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at Clara. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was rough in a completely different way than usual, and she reached up and put her hand against his face. They named the boy Robert after James's father, with the middle name William after Clara's. Robert William Calloway arrived in the world with a great deal to say and apparently no intention of keeping any of it quiet, a characteristic that Mrs. Flores, when she met him 3 days later, and he immediately demonstrated his full vocal range, said indicated he would be a man of strong opinions. "He gets it from his mother," James said. Clara did not bother to deny it. The summer passed and the fall came again, and Robert grew the way healthy babies do, by leaps and starts, and the ranch went on and prospered in the slow, solid way of things that are properly tended. Clara had taken over the accounts entirely by now, at James's request, and with considerable relief on both their parts, because she had a gift for it that went beyond bookkeeping and into actual financial planning. Under her management, the ranch cleared more profit in the fall of 1883 than it had in any of the previous 3 years combined, primarily because she had identified a market for beef through a new contract with a growing town to the west that Pete Dunmore said he had been trying to figure out for 2 years. "How did you see it?" James asked. "I read the local newspapers when we're in town," she said. "That town has doubled in population in the past year. They need a regular beef supply and they don't have a local source. We have both the herd and the road access." He shook his head with a slow smile. "James," she said, "stop looking at me like that." "Like what?" "Like I've done something surprising. You should be used to me by now." "I should be," he agreed. "And I still find you surprising. I expect I always will." She felt the warmth of that settle over her. "That's a very good thing for a marriage." "I know," he said. 2 years passed in the way that good years pass, which is to say quickly and with a fullness that makes the speed feel like abundance rather than loss. Robert learned to walk on the porch boards, and then the yard, and then everywhere else he could manage, with the particular fearless determination of a child who has absorbed from both parents a temperament that simply does not consider stopping. He had James's gray-green eyes and Clara's dark hair, and a personality that seemed to be assembling itself from pieces of both of them in a ratio that was constantly renegotiating. The Brennan family remained close friends. their children and Robert developing the fierce and uncomplicated friendships of frontier children who must take their company where they find it. Agnes Hartwell, the postmistress, became something approaching a friend as well, the kind of sharp, loyal, straight-talking friendship that Clara had not known she needed until she had it. Hector Reyes, now 21 and deeply competent, took on more responsibility on the ranch, and eventually James gave him a small parcel of land at the eastern edge of the property to put up his own cabin, an arrangement that made Pete Dunmore say, with characteristic understatement, that it was a smart thing. In the spring of 1885, Clara became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and James was less frightened, or rather the fear was quieter, trained down by the evidence of Robert's safe arrival and Clara's apparently implacable physical resilience. He was still careful with her in the ways that were in his nature, still left lamps burning and filled water pails, and said nothing when she kept working at the accounts when he thought she ought to rest, because he had learned that saying anything about it was less effective than simply ensuring the work was there for her to do when she felt like it. Dr. Hartman said, when he examined her in early spring, that she was in excellent health and he expected no difficulties. "I told James that," Clara said. "And he went and chopped enough firewood to last 3 winters, Dr. Hartman sighed. "He means well. He means everything well," she said. "It's one of the most infuriating things about him. And the least infuriating," she smiled. "Everything else." The second child was a girl, and she arrived in October of 1885 with rather less drama than her brother had, as though she had assessed the situation and decided efficiency was preferable. They named her Alina, after no one in particular, and both of them agreeing that the name suited her on sight, which was itself a small domestic miracle. Alina had Clara's green eyes and James's jaw, and an expression, even in infancy, of determined assessment that made Mrs. Flores say she was going to be a force of nature, which turned out to be entirely accurate. The ranch grew. Not in a showy or overextended way, but steadily, with the particular health of a thing that is being properly managed and genuinely loved. James was a better rancher in 1886 than he had been in 1882, partly because 4 more years of experience will do that to a man, and partly because he now had a partner who could see things from angles he had not considered. He did not carry the solitude of the ranch's early years anymore. He carried Clara, which was an entirely different proposition. He told her this one evening on the front porch in the fall of 1886, when the aspens were gold again, and Alina was asleep in the house, and Robert was supposedly asleep, but almost certainly lying awake categorizing things, because that was what he did. "I want to tell you something," James said. "All right," Clara said. "When I wrote that letter 4 years ago," he said, looking at the valley, "I was trying to be honest about what I could offer. I said I needed a partner and I hoped you'd consider it. I remember. I didn't say what I was actually hoping for," he said, "because I didn't think I was allowed to hope for it. After Maria, I didn't think I could have it, a real marriage. The kind that's," he paused, in the way he paused when he was choosing words with care, "the kind where you don't feel alone even when you're alone." Clara looked at him. "I have that now," he said. "I have it because of you. You came here with a single bag and almost nothing in it, and you gave this place everything you had in it." He stopped again. "You made it a home. You made me something I wasn't before. I don't have a good word for what I mean." "Yes, you do," she said quietly. "You just said it. You're not alone." He looked at her. In the autumn evening light his face was exactly as she had come to know it, angular and weathered and entirely beloved. "You're not alone either," he said. "No," she said, "I'm not. For the first time in a very long time, I'm not." He reached over and took her hand, the way he had on the wagon the evening of the market, back at the beginning when they were still learning each other. His hand was as familiar to her now as her own, and she held it and looked out at the valley and thought about the woman who had stood in a narrow hallway in Cincinnati holding a letter and thought it was the last door. It had not been the last door. It had been the first one. The years that followed, were the years of the ranch's fullest flowering. Clara expanded the kitchen garden into a proper truck garden that supplied not just the family but, in good years, surplus to sell in Harlan Creek. She persuaded James, over a winter's worth of conversations, to buy a second breeding bull and rotate the herd in a pattern that improved the quality of the cattle considerably, an idea she had read about in an agricultural circular, and worked out the mathematics of over 2 weeks of evenings at the kitchen table. The profits went up again. She also began teaching Robert his letters and numbers when he turned 4, and found to her pleasure that he was quick and eager and that she had, apparently, some gift for teaching that she had not previously identified. This led, the following winter, to a conversation with Agnes Hartwell about the fact that Harlan Creek still lacked a proper schoolhouse, which led to a meeting with Reverend Marsh, which led to a letter to the Territorial Education Office, which led to a grant of materials and a request for a qualified teacher. Clara was not formally qualified, but she had spent the winter reading every educational text she could get through the Harlan Creek General Store's irregular book ordering. And when she sat down with the Territorial Education Officer who came out in the spring of 1887, she answered his questions with enough precision and confidence that he awarded the teaching position to her over his visible hesitation about her lack of formal credentials. Because she could do things with numbers that he could not, and she had already organized the curriculum more rigorously than any school he'd visited that year. The Harlan Creek Schoolhouse opened in September of 1887, in a one-room building that the community had helped construct over the summer. Clara taught 3 days a week, which was all the schedule of the ranch and 2 young children allowed, and she taught 9 children on those 3 days with a thoroughness that produced measurable results by Christmas. James drove her to the schoolhouse on teaching days and picked her up at the end, and he told her on the second week that he had ridden into town at midday and stood outside the schoolhouse window listening because he wanted to see it. She stared at him. "James, you were explaining fractions," he said. 3 of those children got it in the time I was listening. One of them had apparently been confused about it for 2 years. She did not know what to say to that. "You should have been doing this all along," he said. "Teaching." "I'm doing it now," she said. "Yes," he said. "Yes, you are." He looked so proud she had to look away before she made a complete fool of herself. The winter of 1887 was the hardest the valley had seen in a decade. A blizzard in January dropped 4 feet of snow in 2 days, blocking the road to town for 3 weeks and turning the ranch into a self-contained world. James and Hector worked through it with the grim efficiency of men who have planned for hard winters, and Clara kept the household running and the accounts up to date and read to the children by lamplight in the evenings, and they were warm and well fed, and the cattle losses were far lower than the neighboring ranches, because James had brought the most vulnerable animals into the barn in October when Clara had read the weather reports in the territorial paper and predicted a hard winter. When the road opened in February and they made the trip to town, Agnes Hartwell told them that 2 ranches to the north had lost significant portions of their herds and that the Calloway Ranch's losses, which were minimal, were being discussed with some admiration. "You prepared," Agnes said. "Clara prepared," James said. "We prepared," Clara said firmly. Agnes looked between them with the bright, sharp attention she applied to everything and appeared deeply satisfied. By 1889, when Colorado Territory was moving actively toward statehood, the Calloway Ranch was one of the most consistently profitable operations in the valley. Not the largest, not the most dramatic, but solid and well-run, and respected in the way that things are respected when they have been built honestly by people who knew what they were doing. James was known throughout the county as a fair man and a good rancher. Clara was known as the woman who had started the Harlan Creek School and who could read a survey map better than the county surveyor and who ran the tightest set of accounts in the valley, and also, privately, as someone you genuinely wanted on your side in a difficult situation. Pete Dunmore retired in the spring of 1889, after a knee that had been giving him trouble for 2 years finally made further ranch work impractical. James gave him a generous settlement and the use of a small cabin on the eastern boundary of the property, where he lived with considerable independence and came to dinner at the main house every Sunday, contributing to the conversation a running commentary on everything that was happening in the valley, which was the most complete and accurate source of local news in the county. Hector Reyes by now had a wife of his own, a young woman named Isabella who had come down from her family's ranch in the mountains, and they had built up the cabin on the eastern edge into something considerably more substantial. Their first child was born in 1888. By 1890, they were effectively partners in the Calloway operation in all practical senses, which James formalized with a handshake agreement that had all the moral force of a legal document between people who both understood that moral force was the only kind worth having. Robert turned 7 in the summer of 1890 and showed every sign of having both his parents' stubborn streak and neither parent's patience for standing still. He was in everything and curious about everything, and had, by the age of 7, already extracted promises from both James and Clara to answer questions they had not quite managed to formulate complete answers to. James said, privately, that Robert was going to require considerably more education than Harlan Creek could provide, and Clara said she had already written to a school in Denver to ask about their curriculum, and James looked at her and said he did not know why he was surprised. Eleanor, at 4, was quieter than her brother and more observant, with an eye for detail that Clara recognized as something specifically useful and James recognized as something specifically formidable. She had appointed herself the official keeper of a small notebook in which she recorded things she considered important, in her best 4-year-old approximation of letters, and the notebook was treated by all adults in the household as a document of some gravity. In the fall of 1890, Colorado was admitted to the Union as a proper state, and the Valley celebrated with a gathering at the Harlan Creek Town Square that included every family within 20 miles, and a level of enthusiasm that suggested people had been waiting a long time to have this particular party. Clara stood in the square with James beside her, and Eleanor on her hip and Robert making increasingly ambitious circuits of the perimeter with the Brennan children, and she looked at the mountains going pink in the sunset, and thought about the Tuesday afternoon in Cincinnati when she had folded a letter and packed a single carpet bag. 8 years. 8 years between that woman and this one, and the distance was not only in miles. James put his arm around her from behind and rested his chin on the top of her head, which he could do because he was considerably taller and which he did sometimes in quiet moments when no particular words were needed. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking I'm glad I wrote the letter," she said. "I'm glad you wrote it too," he said. "Every day." She leaned back against him and Eleanor patted her mother's cheek with a small proprietorial hand, and in the square the fiddle had started up again, and someone had lit the lanterns and the mountain stood eternal and enormous at the edge of the valley under a Colorado sky that had never stopped being the most beautiful thing Clara had ever seen. The following spring, 1891, brought one more change that completed the picture in the way a final piece closes a puzzle. James formally registered the ranch, with Clara's name on the deed beside his own. He had gone to the county registrar in February and come back with the paperwork without telling her what he was doing, and when he put the deed on the kitchen table with both their names on it, she looked at it for a long moment and then looked at him. "When did you do this?" she said. "February," he said. "I should have done it when we married. I'm sorry it took me this long." "James, you built this place as much as I did," he said. "More in some ways. It should have your name on it from the beginning." She picked up the document and held it and felt the weight of it, not physically but in the other sense, the weight of a thing that says you are real and you belong here and this is yours. "Thank you," she said softly. He sat down across from her at the table where they had done so many hours of accounts and planning and the quiet, regular work of a shared life. "No," he said. "Thank you. You came here with nothing and you gave everything you had. The least I can do is make sure the record says so." She looked at him across the table, this man who was still, after 9 years, capable of surprising her, this man whose careful, honest letter had been the door she had not known she was looking for. "I didn't come with nothing," she said. "I came with everything. I just hadn't had anywhere to put it yet." He reached across the table and she put her hand in his, the way they had done 1,000 times before, and would do 1,000 times again. Outside the kitchen window, the spring was coming in fast and green across the valley, the creek running high and clear, the cattle moving through the new grass, the aspens at the edge of the property putting out their first small leaves. Inside the house, Eleanor was engaged in some project that involved her notebook and a considerable quantity of flour, the nature of which would become clearer and more alarming in approximately 10 minutes. Robert was visible through the window, riding Biscuit's daughter, a 4-year-old mare named Crumble who had inherited her mother's good temperament, in careful circles around the yard, practicing a technique Hector had showed him the day before. The Calloway ranch sat on its rise above the creek in the spring light, solid and rooted and belonging, entirely, to the two people who sat at its kitchen table with their hands together and the deed between them. And it would go on belonging to them, and to the children who ran its yards and would eventually run its pastures, and to the children after them, built on the foundation of a letter and a carpet bag, and a man who gave without flagging it, and a woman who arrived with almost nothing and found, in the giving of what she had, that she had far more than she had known. The creek ran clear and quick through the cottonwoods. The mountain stood above the valley, permanent and enormous and blue in the spring morning. The cattle moved through the new grass, and inside the house that James Calloway had built with $60 and a borrowed horse and an inability to stop trying, the life he had made with Clara Whitmore was as full and solid and honestly good as anything that had ever been made in that valley, on that land, under that vast Colorado sky. It was, by any measure that mattered, everything.